Korean War saw the independent Air Force in battle for the first time. It was the hot war nobody wanted. And at the same time, the Cold War was getting colder. It was the time of the Strategic Air Command, of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and the concept of massive retaliation. In the 1950s, the USAF became the most powerful military force in history. I'm Walter Boyne, and this is the story of the United States Air Force. The newly independent Air Force in the late 1940s was little more than a flying club, pathetically downsized from its mighty World War II predecessor. But waiting in the wings was the extraordinary Curtis LeMay, ready to confront the Soviet Union, even as war raged in Korea. The Strategic Air Command was established in 1946, the year before the Air Force became independent of the Army. The new command's name sounded impressive, but in fact, it was a rundown shadow of the wartime Army Air Forces. It had only 9 bombardment groups and 2 fighter groups. Until its B-50s arrived, SAC did not have true intercontinental range. It stumbled along, ill-equipped, poorly manned, and virtually untrained for 2 years. In April 1948, the Soviet Union seized Czechoslovakia. At that point, President Truman clearly defined the nature of the Cold War emergency by citing Russia as the potential enemy.
This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union. The future of civilization depends on what we do now, and in the months ahead.
The blockade of Berlin had dispelled all doubts about Stalin's intentions, and there was never any possibility of fielding an army that could match the Soviet blocs in size. The United States Air Force was convinced that strategic bombardment was more than the essential key to victory. With a nuclear capability, it was a key to world peace. The answer was air power, and the answer to air power was Curtis LeMay. Probably no leader in modern history had the personal impact on his command that Curtis LeMay did on the Strategic Air Command.
A lot of people think LeMay was mean. No, LeMay was tough. He was tough like a wartime combat commander should be tough.
LeMay had the wonderful capability of intimidating his boss and intimidating the higher headquarters. And that gives you a lot of freedom of action.
It is not an overstatement to say that LeMay was the architect of the instruments that enforced the Pax Americana of the Cold War period. He was forced to build his command at the time of the greatest possible peril. He immediately set about conforming it to his own vision of a striking force.
Base to base and support ourselves for a minimum of 30 days. Everything in this command is dedicated to placing bombs accurately on enemy industrial areas and other targets in the shortest possible time. SAC is a global striking force. To us, the only difference between peace and war is where we place our bombs.
He didn't enjoy hurting people. He would absolutely cut your throat, though, if you weren't mission-oriented, or you weren't prepared to do your job, or you didn't devote all of your attention to that job. And I saw that many, many times.
LeMay's force would defend against any potential atomic attack by being so powerful that it could deliver an annihilating blow to any enemy. This was the philosophy by which England had ruled the seas for 2 centuries, and LeMay was convinced it was now the only defense possible for the United States.
Pilot checklist complete. Ready for takeoff.
Roger, give me 100% on the jet.
Roger. Jet's coming up.
Engineer, give me full power.
Full power coming on. Jet's 100%. Sail pod temp okay.
Takeoff power is set. Everything stabilized. Engineer ready for takeoff. Roger.
There were some who say LeMay advocated preventive war. That's false. Sometimes he'd fire for effect and people might misread what he had to say.
LeMay began a program of intensified training and evaluation, which has been continuously refined to this day.
It was disciplined. We're all going to do it the same way, and we're going to make that same way as right and as competent and as capable as we can. And we're going to evolve it all the time so that it represents the best way to do the job, and then we're all going to do it that way. And that's SAC standardization. Now, a lot of people say SAC standardization and then vomit, you know, because it was so demanding. But it really paid off.
Last month, airplane flying time in our squadron dropped 3%.
Flight crews were not his only concern. He established equally high criteria for every aspect of SAC life, including maintenance, logistics, and weather reporting.
There may have been good reasons for it, but only results count. Our plane is going to be in this next mission if we have to work 24 hours a day. So let's get at it, but quick.
LeMay's legacy was train every day as if it were your wartime mission. And we did that, and we measured it mercilessly.
The September 23, 1949 disclosure of the Russian explosion of an atomic bomb lent increased urgency to LeMay's efforts.
And he had responsibility for nuclear weapons, and you could not look the other way with something that important or that significant in your custody.
By 1950, results began to show. SAC now had 962 tactical aircraft, with jet bombers about to enter the inventory. It had demonstrated its global reach using in-flight refueling. For the first time since he took command of SAC, LeMay felt he had forged a weapon that could preserve peace through nuclear deterrence. And then came the letdown. Instead of confronting the Soviet threat of world domination through nuclear power, he was ordered to send his units to Korea to fight a small war with conventional bombs. Not before, during, or after the war did America have a strong interest in Korea, other than its proximity to Japan. America had no desire to enter a land campaign against Red China or start an atomic conflict with the Soviet Union. World War II had ended, and people were eager to get on with their lives in an economy showing the first signs of a boom. But many lives would go on hold again as the situation in Korea deteriorated. By the end of World War II, Korea had been ruled ruthlessly by Japan for more than 40 years. America and the Soviet Union divided it at the 38th parallel as a convenient way to accept the surrender of the Japanese forces. The Soviet Union created the People's Democratic Republic of Korea, north of the parallel. South of the parallel, free elections were held to create the Republic of Korea. Separate trends were established on each side of the parallel. In South Korea, all of the occupying U.S. troops, except for a small advisory force, had left by July 1949. In contrast, China had provided North Korea with training and with many regular army units, hardened in the long and recent Chinese Civil War. The Soviet Union equipped the North Korean army with first-rate weapons. But the North Korean Air Force had only about 160 aircraft. They included Soviet Sturmovix and Yak piston-engine fighters. On June 25, 1950, the North Korean Army swarmed over the 38th parallel in a march to the sea, intending to conquer and annex South Korea. President Truman ordered the old warhorse, General Douglas MacArthur, to take the necessary military action to defend Korea. MacArthur was keenly aware how long it would take to get American forces on the ground into action. He called on the Far Eastern Air Force to hit the North Koreans with everything they had. It wasn't much. 8 combat squadrons were sent into action. 2 were Douglas B-26 light bombers. The only modern aircraft were Lockheed F-80 jet fighters. Their targets were anything of military value from Seoul north to the 38th parallel. B-29s from Okinawa soon joined in, and for the next 6 days, these few aircraft prevented a Dunkirk-style retreat for American forces. The sheer momentum of the North Korean attack had worked. It compressed the remnants of the Republic of Korea's army and the U.S. contingent in the perimeter around Busan. 150,000 North Korean troops, organized into 13 rifle divisions, a tank brigade, a mechanized division, and a tank division, threatened the Busan perimeter. Defending the perimeter were 5 badly mauled and demoralized Republic of Korea divisions and a Marine brigade. The F-80 jet fighters couldn't operate from the unimproved South Korean airfields, so 6 squadrons of the venerable North American F-51 Mustangs were introduced, refugees from storage depots. Squadrons that had just converted to F-80 jets found themselves going into combat with Mustangs on a day's notice.
But I'd never even flown a P-51 that had even drop tanks on it, let alone one that had 2 napalm cans, full load of ammunition, and 6 rockets on it. I mean, that's a completely different airplane, you know?
The F-51s were launched time and time again to keep the North Korean forces in check. They were directed by forward air controllers, flying low and slow.
The forward air controller, he was delighted to see us because he had a lot going on, and he'd come in and fire a rocket, and he said, "Okay, right there." He said, "That's a great spot. Put a napalm can right there." So the leader would come in, and he'd drop a napalm, and we'd go back around. And one by one, he directed by using his rockets and that sort of thing. He directed where he wanted the rest of us to put stuff.
F-80s continued to operate from Japan, flying at the very limits of their range and returning with absolutely minimum fuel.
You would strafe, napalm, bomb, whatever, on the other side of the line, and you're actually, you can look at the guys that you're shooting and napalming and stuff. You see them swarming towards our guys and all that, and obliterate a bunch of them. It gave you a great deal of satisfaction knowing that you were taking care of the good guys on our side of the line.
The pace of the war increased steadily. The 5th Air Force, led by Major General Earl C. Partridge, demonstrated the flexibility of air power by its quick reaction to target changes. Sometimes a mission would be diverted en route to the new target in response to an Army request. The 8th Army commander, Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, later stated for the record that he could not have stayed in Korea without the 5th Air Force support. The tide turned rapidly. On July 24th, General MacArthur had assumed the duties of Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command. On September 15th, he launched his daring Incheon invasion, which began the rout of North Korean forces. Incheon was in many ways reminiscent of June 6, 1944, D-Day in France. Lieutenant General George E. Stratemeyer directed his Far Eastern Air Force to fly reconnaissance. This was partly to determine the high and low tide heights of the seawalls that would have to be scaled. Then Stratemeyer began an interdiction campaign to take out enemy rail lines, bridges, and tunnels to isolate the area. U.S. fighters roamed over North Korean airfields to suppress enemy aircraft. The Navy and Marines provided close air support for the invasion. Meanwhile, in a coordinated effort in the South, B-29s laid down a carpet bombing attack. It helped the 8th Army break out of the bridgehead at Busan and sweep north. The weather began to clear, and the 5th Air Force mounted more and more close support sorties. They used rockets and napalm to break communist resistance. At the same time, there was a successful strategic bombing campaign. In a single month, Far Eastern Air Force Bomber Command B-29s destroyed North Korea's capacity to support its troops in the field. It was a tribute to the methods Curtis LeMay had instilled in his crews. Chinese aerial opposition stiffened. The B-29s were forced to turn to night bombing. It continued for the remainder of the war. 167,100 tons of bombs were dropped in 21,328 combat sorties. It was a major effort by a force that never exceeded 100 aircraft. On October 20th, 1950, one of the most successful parachute operations in history helped bottle up the retreating communist forces. C-119s and C-47s of Combat Cargo Command dropped 2,860 paratroopers and 300 tons of equipment to straddle the main roads north of Pyongyang. The North Korean troops fled their strongly fortified positions. They were pursued by elements of the 8th Army that were being supplied almost totally by airlift. The Chinese warned that they would intervene. General MacArthur assured President Truman that they would not. He based his assumptions in part on the fact that the Chinese had no air force. It was a fateful, near fatal conclusion. United Nations ground forces followed the Koreans beyond the 38th parallel. The Chinese did exactly what they said they were going to do, but on a far greater scale than anyone had imagined. The initial Chinese intervention was by air. Piston engine fighters attacked American aircraft. Then came the swept-wing jets, MiG-15s. The first all-jet battle in history took place on November 8, 1950. F-80s of the 51st Interceptor Wing were jumped by MiGs. The F-80s were clearly outclassed. The MiGs were a brilliant design. They combined Russian and German technology. Ironically, they were powered by a derivative of a British engine, the Rolls-Royce Nene. The British had sold several to Russia a few years previously. The MiGs represented a real threat to air superiority. If employed in sufficient numbers, they would drive UN aircraft from the air at the time of greatest need.
The MiG had a better rate of climb than we did. It had a shorter range, but it had a better rate of climb, and on a short-term basis, he could put you in a lot of trouble. Not for very long, but he didn't need to do it too long.
The UN forces were roughly thrown back by more and more Chinese troops crossing the border. Orders began to come from MacArthur's headquarters that would be echoed one war later in Vietnam. The general wanted the bridges across the Yalu River destroyed to slow the oncoming Chinese reinforcements, but only the portions on Korean territory were to be attacked. There was to be no violation of Manchurian territory or airspace. As a result, the bombers had to make their runs parallel to the river. This exposed them for the greatest length of time to anti-aircraft fire. It also exposed them to the MiGs. The MiGs would circle at altitude to locate a target. They'd make a diving attack across the Yalu River through the bomber formations. They could then streak back to safety on the other side of the river. Fortunately, most of the time, the MiGs were not aggressive. There was time to bring in the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing of F-86 Sabres from the United States. Like the U.S. cavalry riding to the rescue, eager and aggressive Air Force pilots took the North American F-86 to Korea to fight the Soviet MiGs. With its swept wings, powerful armament, and high maneuverability, the F-86 soon made itself king of MiG Alley. Less well known, but perhaps even more important, was the arrival of the 27th Fighter Escort Wing of straight-wing Republic F-84 Thunderjets. Rugged as a tank and damn near as heavy, the Republic F-84 Thunderjet was the premier ground attack fighter of the Korean War. Able to operate out of primitive airfields, carrying huge loads of bombs, rockets, and napalm, the F-84 struck continuously at enemy troop concentrations, bridges, trains. Once its ordnance was gone, it was able to turn with the MiGs at low altitude. All in all, the F-84 was a great fighter, the right plane at the right time. As the 8th Army fought its desperate retreat, sometimes the only thing that changed destruction to escape was the timely appearance of the Thunderjets, laden with rockets, napalm, and bombs. The F-84s of the 49th Group made the waters of the Chongchong River literally run red with the blood of Chinese infantry. Air attacks accounted for more than 33,000 Chinese dead by the end of December. But the Chinese strength was overwhelming. An estimated 500,000 men pushed the UN forces back. They swept on past Seoul, overrunning the F-86 bases and forcing the Sabres' return to Japan. The early model Sabres were temporarily out of the war, limited by their short 490-mile range. The Chinese had succeeded in inverting doctrine. They had gained air superiority through controlling the airfields. They began stockpiling huge quantities of MiGs in the Manchurian sanctuary so they could be brought down into Korea for the final push. But continual attrition by air attack and stubborn ground defense had bled the Red Army. The UN forces counterattacked. They drove the Red Army forces back far enough to allow the F-86 air bases to be reestablished.
Oh, fire sweep a day.
The air war in MiG Alley, a triangular corner south of the Yalu River, resumed. Again, almost every condition was advantageous to the communists. Flying from bases in the Manchurian sanctuary, the MiGs could choose the time and place of attacks. But the sanctuary was not always observed.
Look back in.
When it got to the point where we had to measure crossing the river against saving a bunch of guys, then we crossed the river. I kept about, I'd say 75 to 80 MiG-15s on the ground by shooting up the first two that tried to get off. Two of them on the end of the runway, up on their nose, gears collapsed, big plumes of black smoke going up there, and the rest of them just turned around and taxied back in. So we kept that entire airbase down with 4 airplanes. We saved a lot of lives by doing it, and if I had to get court-martialed even today by somebody who said that was wrong and you shouldn't have done it, I'd take it.
The F-86s were operating at the limit of their range. They had only a few minutes to spend on station. There were about 300 MiGs available against 90 to 127 F-86. But these were nominal strength, with probably no more than half available operationally on either side at a given moment. The F-86 was considered superior to the MiG in most respects. The MiGs had a higher ceiling and a better rate of climb, but the Sabres had better armament and were better gun platforms. At the start of the conflict, the Sabre pilots were generally more experienced.
I can remember at one time attacking a flight of 8 from the rear, and one by one they kept peeling off, and each time, you know, I'd watch the guy peel off expecting that he's going to turn around and come back in on me, and if he had, I would have left. But they never did come back in, and I peeled them all down to finally to the #1 guy, and then shot him down and went home.
As time went on, new pilots right out of flying school joined the F-86 units. Some were firing their guns for the first time in combat.
Are you still clear? Okay, he's down, but you got him too.
On the whole, the USAF training and spirit were superior to that of the communists, who were only occasionally aggressive. Apart, that is, from the honchos, Soviet pilots flying for North Korea.
They had some guys that had read Chapter 2. There was no doubt in my mind about that.
In the end, the figures told the story. 792 MiGs were shot down at the cost of 78 F-86s. This 10-to-1 ratio was to breed a costly degree of overconfidence in the next war. Although America clearly won the air war in Korea, that fact has been forgotten. Few now remember the utterly valiant work done by crews flying World War II equipment under some of the worst weather and operating conditions in history to save the UN forces from both tactical and strategic defeat. Night after night, the aging Douglas B-26s would skim through the black, narrow valleys, destroying North Korean traffic. War-weary B-29s bombed endlessly, missing operations on only a score of days throughout the entire war. Even less well-known are the critically important efforts of the Combat Cargo Command. It hauled troops in and evacuees out and carried ton after ton of cargo where no roads reached. The scale was smaller than in World War II, but its importance was just as crucial: the preservation of air superiority. Perhaps the most important use of air power in Korea was diplomatic. The peace negotiations at Panmunjom dragged on, apparently unending and unendable. Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt Vandenberg began pressing for more extensive action. At the same time, John Foster Dulles let the Chinese know that America was frustrated enough to use atomic weapons in Manchuria. Vandenberg authorized the transfer of nuclear weapons to Okinawa in preparation for the time when they might be used. The Chinese got the message, and peace negotiations accelerated. The effects of the bitter police action in Korea lingered on in the Air Force. For the first time in American history, it was recognized both by the Congress and the public that a permanent professional military establishment of huge proportions was going to have to be maintained. Korea was the training ground for the USAF. It endowed a professional force with a degree of discipline that existed in World War II. That same discipline was now reestablished in the Strategic Air Command. The Strategic Air Command built up its strength at a phenomenal rate. For many years, its mainstay was the 10-engine Convair B-36. It was huge and ponderous, but it had the range and the altitude capability to reach any target in Russia. The B-36s were first supplemented with almost 2,000 B-47s. The Boeing B-47, first flown in 1947, took 4 years of development before it entered operational service. There were only 12 in the fleet in 1951. The numbers grew rapidly, from 329 in 1953 to 1,533 in 1958. The B-47, with its in-flight refueling capability, gave SAC an intercontinental weapon of overpowering might. In its early years, it was virtually invulnerable. It could fly too high and too fast for contemporary interceptors to catch. Man, I really love this airplane. It was fast, beautiful, wonderful to fly. The B-47 was also one of the most important jet aircraft in history, for from it stemmed the B-52, the KC-135, the 707, and all the civilian passenger transport derivatives. SAC had as many as 1,800 of these aircraft in its inventory at one time, and when it did, the United States enjoyed an absolutely unprecedented strategic dominance. In the event of a communist invasion of Europe, the USAF war plan called for a concerted attack on the Soviet Union. This was described as the front-to-rear concept. The fleet of B-47s would destroy all targets, from the borders back to the sources of production and government direction. A 6-day attack would have left the Russian armies to wither in the field, their homeland demolished. United States losses would have been relatively low.
We felt that this was our contribution to the peace in the world. And we had to make war so awful. And we had to make our capability so responsive and so real that we were anxious to demonstrate it. You know, I would have demonstrated it to any member of the Soviet Air Force, Army, or Navy, or if they'd come over, I wanted them to see what I could do because I knew it was real. To deter, you know, you not only have to have capability, but you got to know how to use it.
There was no invasion of Europe because the Soviet Union was well aware of the B-47's capabilities. But the B-47 was a curious mixture of old and new technologies. Its swept wings and jet engines would point the way to future bombers and to the entire fleet of jet transports that now unite the world. But its structure was based on older technology that did not lend itself to the stresses of high-speed, high-altitude flight. It was soon phased out in favor of a larger aircraft, the Boeing B-52. The B-52 would become the long rifle of the Strategic Air Command. Like the B-47, the B-52 was intended to be a high-altitude nuclear bomber, one that would streak in alone to take out a city. Some people tried to tell Kurt LeMay that he needed a smaller airplane. The B-52 was going to be too big. He'd need new hangars, new runways. It'd be too expensive. But Kurt LeMay wasn't having any. He told them that he didn't know how long he was going to have to fly the airplane, and he wanted it big enough to accommodate to whatever was required. Well, this airplane, which first flew in 1952, was big enough, all right. It's still flying. It'll be flying in the 21st century. Kurt LeMay got the big airplane he wanted. He also got a great airplane. The necessary companion to the B-52 was the Boeing KC-135 tanker. It was fast enough to refuel the B-52 without the discomfort and danger experienced by the slower piston engine tankers.
And we bought 600 of them, and that was one of the most fortuitous buys in the world. And we're still using them, and we'll be using them until 2020, and maybe beyond. That's because we bought enough, we bought the right aircraft, and we've spent the money that was needed in order to keep it up. We've re-engined it, we've reskinned it, we've re-stressed it. You know, if you do it right, and that was done right, the payoff comes in a 60-year airplane that's still first rate, still top flight.
The biggest change in the mission, capability, and psychology of the Air Force came about in 1955. President Eisenhower issued a directive to give the intercontinental ballistic missile top priority. By 1955, the size of the hydrogen bomb had been reduced. It was now feasible to deliver one on a missile with a 5,000-mile range. Since 1946, the USAF had been developing nuclear-capable, long-range, pilotless aircraft. The Northrop SM-62 Snark was the first intercontinental missile. The next step in missile development was to create a viable intercontinental ballistic missile program. In 1953, an illustrious 10-man committee was recruited by the Air Force to study the problem of nuclear missiles. The group included a young colonel, Bernard A. Schriever, who would become the management genius behind America's missile program. The task was urgent. The Soviet Union had a lead in missile development. The first priority was acceleration of the Convair Atlas. A systems engineering concept was essential. All the elements of a weapon system, including design, testing, production, training, logistics, deployment, and maintenance, were considered simultaneously and analyzed continuously. Because of the urgency of the need, there was a tremendous amount of cooperation in the Atlas program, and also a tremendous amount of risk. The project was blessed by a series of advances in key areas: structure, control, and re-entry. The result was an operational Atlas missile capability by 1959. The Strategic Air Command's buildup in missile strength proceeded rapidly. By 1961, there were 20 missile squadrons, including Atlas, Titan, and Minuteman units. The liquid-fueled Atlas and Titan ICBMs were first-generation missiles. They had reliability problems. The quick introduction of the Minuteman solid-fuel ICBM placed the arsenal on a new, higher plane. The first Minuteman unit of 10 missiles became operational on October 24, 1962, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The missile force was seen by the Air Force to be a newfangled branch that needed and got a different type of individual for service. Their jobs were demanding and important, but missile crews did not feel that they had the respect flight crews commanded. And they knew that they did not have the extra flight pay enjoyed by pilots. It took years of conscious effort to overcome the second-class citizen syndrome of the missile force. That was a feeling heightened by the remote locations of most missile stations. In the 50s and 60s, the Cold War flashed hot with terrifying frequency. The reconnaissance mission was a deadly game of cat and mouse, each side learning from the other. By May 1960, SAC had achieved its self-imposed goal of having 1/3 of its 3,000 bombers and tankers on a 15-minute alert basis. President Kennedy increased this to 50% the following year in response to heightened world tension. The effect of the alert system on families and crew members was devastating. It was compounded by additional training for war readiness. Crew members routinely worked 80 to 100 hours a week, creating single-parent families long before the term became current. But all of this cost, sacrifice, and effort paid off suddenly in the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. In October, a SAC U-2 reconnaissance plane overflew Cuba. It took photographs of Soviet intermediate-range ballistic missiles being installed. The B-52 airborne alert program was intensified, the 200 operational ICBMs were brought to an alert status. In the famous catchphrase of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union were eyeball to eyeball, and the Soviets blinked.
The deterrence is in the fact that it's god-awful. And everybody would say, well, you're trying to make it so awful. You're right. That was why the Soviets didn't challenge us, and that's why we would have thought many times over before we responded. This nuclear weaponry is god-awful.
The rapid growth of the Air Force in size and power was more than matched by the increased demands made upon it. The policy of nuclear deterrence had succeeded. There had been no nuclear exchange. Instead, there was a clear equilibrium. The country remained committed to the use of atomic weapons as a deterrent to all wars, large or small. But the concept of fighting a limited war was about to be put to a very tough test in Indochina. The situation America was about to confront in Vietnam would be uncannily similar in many ways to the war in Korea. The grand roles planned for SAC, with its intercontinental bombers and ICBMs, would not play well in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War would test the United States Air Force in a theater it had no wish to enter.